Hello, and welcome to today's edition of Watercolor Workshops with Mekhla Salimani. My name is Jeremy Worley, and I work in the program department of LCPL, and I'll be your host today. Please feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen if you have any questions or comments for our artist, and I can relay them to her. Mekhla Salimani was born and raised in India and has lived in Loudoun County for over 2 decades. Much of her art is inspired by her rich, vibrant Indian culture and by the natural beauty in her new home. She is an architect and product designer by education and currently a coach in technology that influences product development, process, and delivery. Mekhla sells her paintings and original greeting cards at the Leesburg Farmers Market and donates much of her proceeds to charity. Watercolor is her favorite medium because it encourages freedom of expression. Thank you so much for being here, Mekhla.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for spending a part of your Friday afternoon with us today. I'm looking forward to painting with you all. Jeremy, let me know when I'm ready to start.
You are good to go.
All right. Thank you. So I know Jeremy just said that you were wondering if there was a picture or a reference picture to draw from. I don't have a reference picture because the drawing in this is very easy and simple, and we'll be doing it together. So what you see on the screen is actually my phone here, and we are going to draw a part of a flower. The focus on today's art is we're going to go into a little bit of how to draw the droplets in focus and how to draw the background to kind of make your art pop. So this is a flower a sample that you see here. We'll do something similar. I am thinking that I want to do a yellow flower just because I'm feeling the nice warm weather and getting ready for summer. But you could choose to do any color you like. Most of the instructions are good for any color, as long as we are talking about the shade and the light and the depth. You could really choose the color of the flower. Or you could do a leaf like you see in this picture here. It's a close-up of a leaf. So if you want to limit your drawing even further, you could do a leaf. It's painting to me is all about capturing the light and the shadows, which color, it's up to you for which color you choose to do that in. So let's get started. Before we get into drawing, I'd like to walk through the material I have here. I understand many of you may only have a set of basic colors, which is perfectly fine. As we go through this, I will talk about how to create more colors from a basic set of 3 or 4 colors. All right, so I am using a square piece of watercolor paper. I took it off a new brand paper that I'm experimenting with, but it's it's a sketchbook like this, and I took one of these. It's 6 inches by 6 inches. I don't usually paint in square proportions, but I thought this one fits perfect for a square, so it gives us a good balance of the positive and the negative space. Feel free to use any other shape that you think would be a good fit for your work. So that's paper. Watercolor paper is usually thicker. It has more density. So when you look for paper, if you look for watercolor paper, it'll just allow your paint to work better, just based on how it absorbs it, how the color moves, and how it allows you to work in this medium. What's unique about watercolors is you always go from light to dark. Unlike oil paints or acrylics, you could go dark to light or light to dark. So we are in watercolor, you will always be mindful of, if there is something light, that layer goes first, and we build layer upon layer in our watercolor work. I have here with me, as you can see, the basic colors yellow, red, and blue. So what you don't see here is green. If you mix yellow and blue, as many of you may know, we'll get shades of green. Now, if you want the green to be darker, we'll add additional blue, or we can make it lighter with more yellow. And if you want to go towards the brown end, we could add red to it to get a browner color. Now, you also see in the list of materials we have white. I'd like to call out that in watercolor, and this is my personal preference, but I've learned it from a lot of my mentors and people I admire their work. In watercolor, we tend not to use black or white. Just a quick science behind it. White, the color white is not considered as a color. When all colors exist, we're talking about the physics of light, we get white light. And black, in fact, is an absence of light. So they're really not colors technically. But why does it matter to us? It matters to us because in watercolor, we use water a lot. So when we add water, the value of the color is manipulated. So the more water we add, the lighter and more transparent the color would be. So when you add water to black, you start to get a very transparent grayish tone. And if you're using black to get depth, you won't get that. In watercolor, my favorite colors to add depth, to make it darker. When we think of black, we think about making things dark. In that case, I would use really dark blues and browns or deep dark reds to create the same effect that a dark black would give. But we do have white in our list. For now, we will just put it aside. We'll bring it back later into this particular work, because once we do the base layers, we might need need white to highlight the water droplets. As we go through the instructions today, I'll be talking about 3 different ways of doing the water droplets on the flower petals. And I'll introduce you to the material for that. You may or may not have some of those, and that is the reason why I want to share different ways of doing it, so you don't actually have to get special material for it. What else do I have here? I have 3 brushes. As you can tell, this one is really beat, but some things, they just become your favorite and you can't do without it. These brushes are no brand name brushes. I picked them up just at random places. So this is the smaller, finer brush that I'm using, and it's a number 2, this one. And you could use something even finer, but I feel like I don't get enough color unless I'm doing very fine details. I don't go finer than that. This is my medium favorite brush. I've probably had this for 2 decades. And this is a size 6, and this is a size 8. We may not need much of the 8. We actually might need it for the first layer, and then we will move into using the medium brush for the most part, and then the finer one for details. What I have here is a ceramic plate that I use as a palette. I like to use a palette without the specific spaces for some work, because most of the time I don't have a specific color I'm using. I'm blending colors, and when I get the hue I want, and it all happens in one place. It's constantly blending, so I don't want it to be separated. I want it to blend, and I see it, I get the feel for it, and use those colors. I do have water in 2 jars here. One is for washing brushes. This gets dirty very quickly, and then every now and then you want to have clean water. In watercolor, water does a lot of the work for you, so you want to keep clean, clear water at hand. What else do I have? I'm going to use a pencil. I hope I don't need an eraser, but just keeping it handy. And yes, you do want to have some kind of rag or old cotton fabric. Kitchen towels work great. This is to wipe your brushes. Every now and then you will be controlling the water quantity on your brush, so you want to keep this handy. And I think that may be everything. So I'm just going to clear my space a little bit. Any questions about the material before we get into drawing and painting? Jeremy, is there anything on the chat?
Nope, we are good to go.
All right, I'm gonna move the water over for a few minutes until we draw. So this is actually a flower I had painted, I want to say last year. So I don't have the hard copy. I think it's sold in one of the farmers market, and we're going to go with that. So I particularly like a composition where I have a balance of the positive and negative space, which means the positive space is the subject that we are drawing or creating, and the negative is behind it, which is not the main subject, but it is equally important as the subject. If there wasn't any black space, we wouldn't be able to appreciate or concentrate on the subject. So I personally think whether it's photography or composing a design, whether it's for painting or even arranging things in your home, when you decide to put furniture around, you're constantly thinking of the space around it, not only the space it occupies. So in this composition, we're going to start with a half flower. A couple of design tips that I often talk about is we try not to divide up our canvas or paper into halves. So if I were to, I'm looking for a, so if I were to divide this in equal halves, like 4, and do the flower in an exact half space, that way it visually cuts the space too much, and then we can't go, the eye movement doesn't go back and forth into those spaces. So there's a rule of thirds. Some of you may have heard me talk about it before. A rule of thirds is where when we compose things vertically or horizontally, we think of it in 3 parts, not 2. We don't divide it in half, and we let the subject float, or 2 parts of the composition be in that proportion. So we'll try, the thirds here would be somewhere around here on my paper. I know it may be hard to see because I'm trying not to draw too hard on it. And I let the flower petals come up to here, and then there'll be some space around it. With the same rule in mind, I don't want to put the center of the flower at the center vertically. I'm going to shift it a little down here. So if you can see this partial center of the flower, I'm going to place it on the lower third of the paper. And it doesn't have to be exact. It's just approximation, just the way the eye travels around the paper. We don't want it to be split too hard in the center. So as you see here, I didn't like the curve I first made. I did over it, and honestly, you don't even have to erase it because the paint will cover it. All right. So I'm thinking of a yellow flower, like maybe a sunflower or, a daisy or anything with long petals and a deep core center here. Don't be too fixed on the type of flower, or the focus is on the colors and the effect on it. So we'll just start from here. When you're drawing the petals, think about lines radiating out, like you just want to kind of draw a reference radiating lines like these, so we don't get the direction of the petals go too out of the radial, the center from here. So you see this? I'm going to start somewhere here, not too wide at the center, and then just free flowing go out to have these nice loose petals. Start with this. To make it look natural, you want to do a little overlap like this. One thing you could do is do the shorter petal layer first and do a few that are a little bit longer. So starting here, you see what I'm doing here? I started here, not going to draw, but get some reference to complete the petal here. This one is shorter and wider, and that's where we are creating some variance in the petal types. Everybody's flower will be different. Everybody's shades will be different. But we can't go wrong with flowers. They're pretty in every color, in every way. So just feel free. Don't hesitate to create your own unique flower. I'm going to draw a short petal here and then a longer one in the back. So as I look at this flower here, I realize I drew the radiating out, lines radiating out, but this one is not following that. You see how this petal is going down? So to my eye, it looks incorrect there. So I'm going to erase that a little bit to make sure that they are all pointing in the direction we started the petals to go in. I'm going to leave this one out because it's nice how, you know, not every petal is perfect with the wind and such. They turn around, but this one I'm going to switch it over to go in the direction we started in. And if you feel like you need to add more petals, we can do that too. I think a skinny one here would be nice. I often find it hard to stop, and then I feel like, hey, I should have stopped there. I didn't need that last bit. So it's always nice to stop, take a step back, look, see if the proportions are looking right. Give yourself a second to make sure that that's where you want to go with it. All right. Any questions about the drawing? This is it.
Yep, no questions so far.
All right. What you also want to do, because we're going to do the droplets, let's place the droplets, at least the big ones. So those are the areas we'll try not to put too much dark pigment on it, and we should be able to create the three-dimension effect on the droplets. So the drops are a little flattened, oval-ish. Doesn't have to be perfect. Sometimes you do see almost perfect circle like drops, but usually when the drop hits the leaf or the petal, it spreads a little. So think about it as an oval about this size. Of course, you can have them in many sizes because one big drop will kind of split into so many little tiny droplets, and those look really beautiful too. So it's up to you. I'm going to draw a few big ones. I don't want to overdo it. Every now and then I feel like if I had fewer droplets, it would have been a more impactful visual. So just think through putting in a few smaller ones. And if maybe later with white, we could do some really tiny ones. All right. That's it for my droplets. Another thing I really like to do is for things to look natural, I like to do a half of something. So not always is a pattern completely fitting into our space, right? So there could be a droplet on the edge of this petal or one at the edge of this petal. So you don't see the whole thing. It looks more real. All right, so with that, that's it for drawing. Not a heavy drawing kind of activity here. So we'll start painting. I'm going to bring my water really close to me. I'll be dipping into that a lot, very frequently. Going to start with the larger brush to give the first coat of color to the flower. Now I just realized sometimes I put a border to my painting, so it when you finish it, you have a white border. But this one, I personally prefer to not have a border because it's a half flower, so it's extending out, and you don't want to limit it with a frame. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a piece of tape to hold it in place so I don't push it around or away from the camera. You don't have to do it if you don't need to, but I want to make sure it stays in the center for you all to see. All right, so this should keep it in place. So I do want to talk about the options I mentioned for doing the petals. Now, the easiest one would be, so this is called, this is actually color resist. It's called drawing gum. What it does, it actually, you put it on the drawing and then you can paint over it and then scrape it off the paper, and then you can add the details of the petal or of the droplets on it. I didn't know about it until recently, honestly. So if you don't have it, that's perfectly fine. I don't expect most people to have it. I didn't have it until not too long ago. But just so you know that this is an option available to you, not only for this, it's super useful for many watercolor things that you could be doing where you want to kind of hide off some space and detail that out later. So I just did 2 droplets with that for you to see. It takes a minute or so to dry, but by the time we do the other things, that will dry. Another easy fix to that is use some painter's tape like this, cut it into an oval or just about that shape, doesn't have to be perfect again, and tape it on that spot so you can, keep the color out of that. Not the best method, but it works. When you don't have the masking fluid, you can use masking tape. So it's just so you know that this option is something you could explore in a crunch. The third one would be, we would just be careful around those spaces so we don't uh, put too many dark colors, because once we do dark in watercolor, it's harder to go light. It's not impossible, that's why we have white, but the effect of fresh paper is better than trying to mask a dark space. So I just did 2 of these. Just let's see how it works. These are different ways to do it. And the third, another technique is lifting watercolor, which we'll talk about as we get to it once we do lift color from some of these droplets here. Any questions?
No questions so far.
All right. So I am getting color on my palette. Feel free to choose the color of your flower, pinks, purples, reds, name it. It's the season of flowers. Whatever is inspiring you most from around you, feel free to go with that color. What is going to be common for any flower we do would be how we introduce the dark and the light shades with the grays and the browns. Right. So let's get started with layer 1. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the petals. Keep the water content super high. You are really just doing a wash. It's a first layer wash. It's more water in my brush than color. There's often when I take some color and I feel like, oh, I go in there and I feel like that's too much color, and I go back and either wipe it or add a little bit more water. This is the first layer. You will be adding more layers to it, so that's not going to be the final color. So if we did not mask out the droplet, you want to just keep it at the first layer and not in the next layers. We're probably going to stay out of it. I do like to do it this way because when a droplet falls on a petal, it really doesn't decolor it completely. It just makes it a lot lighter. So in this one, it actually helps to have a little bit of that color tone under the water droplet. You see, this is super simple. We're not doing anything fancy here. This is the first layer. Well, but when you have the masking, either tape or fluid, you don't have to stop and think. You just kind of come back and remove it later. So since this is the first layer, all of our petals are getting the same value. It's I kind of didn't even pause to think whether it should be darker or lighter, right? Now, I don't want it to dry completely. I want to work on it when it's still wet. It's called the wet on wet technique in watercolor. It really helps with blending when you don't want to see brush strokes and the water kind of spreads the color. So when you're not doing detail work, this method works really well. And this is one of the very unique look of a watercolor. The free blending of colors, loose colors, is what's so pleasing for a watercolor painting. It's just light um, and transparent. So I just took a teeny bit more color. Now what I'm going to do is add a little bit more color. So the volume of, not the volume, the quantity of paint to water, still a lot of water, but a little bit more color. And that is going to be for the leaves that are on the bottom side. So if there is an overlap, like you see here, this leaf is full, leaf or petal is full because it's on the top. This one is behind. Now, anything that's closer to us, we see more color and more details on it. Anything that's behind gets the shadow of the thing on the top. So it tends to take a darker tone. So when you're adding dark to the things behind, they will take a darker tone than the ones that are in the front. Still not there. This is not the final dark color. We're going to go much darker. Now, this is also a time where you can start to introduce the petal characteristics of each flower, right? Some flowers will have that middle center rib like thing, which is very subtle in many cases, but you can tell that it has a center to it. So feel free to start doing that. We will enhance it if needed later, but you can just put a, you see how little the variance is, but that's where you start to create the third dimension. Right, I'm not going to do any darker on the spots I've identified for the droplets. We're going to leave it at that. I'm just trying to build a color that's a little bit deeper than the yellow I have. So I'm going to bring in my red to get a little darker orangey yellow. So even a yellow flower, when you paint it or when you see it, may have tones of black, well, dark brown or gray, depending on where the light and the shadow is. So when you are painting a white flower, you might be using a lot of greens and grays to paint a white flower. That's because you're painting the light effects on it. I'm going to start from here, a little bit more organized. I want to give the petal some definition, but don't want to paint it flat one color. So I'm thinking in my mind, the light is coming from the right side here. So the petals will all have a darker tone on the inner side. So where the light hits the petal, that will be the lightest. And then we'll get some darker tones here. So when I add the shades, I'm going to usually have slightly darker on the on the left side, because the light when you start painting, you want to, in your mind, have a sense of where is the light coming from, because you want to stay consistent throughout the painting to keep the light coming from the same direction. Now, since this petal is under that one, it will be overall darker than the top petal. And for the light, it will get even darker closer to the edge of the petal. Now, when I'm trying to do that detail, I'm going to wait for it to dry a little bit more. Or you'll see it blending in and getting into the other spaces. It's a constant reminder, where is the source of light? Right. I'm still working with my wider brush because we're not doing details. We are still working with this is a lot more red. For wet and wet, I usually like to use a wider brush because it's a loose effect. The other watercolor technique or effect would be dry on wet or dry on dry. For details, we'll be doing more dry on dry. We'll wait for this to dry. You see how little the color I've used so far is. It's just a smidge. Still a lot of water. I feel like I moved away from the yellow feel of the flower and it's becoming a little bit more orangey. So I'm going to go back to my yellow. Where is it? And do a little bit more concentrated yellow color on some petal sides to get back my predominantly yellow feel to the flower. That's what I was going for, a very sunshiny yellow. So if you see here now, I do have water in my brush, but I'm using the paint block to get more concentrated color. Do we have any questions?
No questions.
Right. Now I'm switching over to a much darker tone. So I'm going to wait for it to dry a little bit. I don't want it to dry completely, but it's so wet right now. If I put any color, it's going to spread. It's called the cauliflower effect. When you have wet and you put a brush with a little bit of wet on it, it's just kind of going to spread. And you won't be able to control the area where you want that color to stay. So just let it dry halfway through so it's not that watery. But while I'm doing that, we'll start to work on the center. So like I said before, red and green makes brown, right? So you have some red here. But if you don't have green, you can take some blue. You'll start to see a purple-like tone, red and blue together. And then if you add a yellow to it, you'll start to see the brown tones. And as you keep varying the proportion of these colors, you see this is a much lighter brown. And I'll add blues to it to go darker. So blue will make it a greenish brown. If I add more red, I'm going to start to get a darker brown. So that's why I like a palette like this where I'm just mixing it, and there we're starting to see the browns. So you can have a much darker brown for the center, but just like we said, we start with a lighter tone and then we can go darker. I would recommend that we'll do a dot method here, like just use the tip of your medium size brush and just do dots. We don't need these to be dots, but it's nice to leave some white spaces in between. That gives it dimension. And we might want to put a little bit of another color. We will put darker tones, but also another color. Actually, while I'm doing that, I'm thinking I'm going to take the finer brush and get some green also, get it going, because I want a little green tone in the center too. You know how when you see the core of a flower, you'll see some green tones. And if you see there's a bleed here, those bleeds are beautiful. Just not out of control, but if you get some bleeds, they look very beautiful. They look blended nicely. So you see now I have a little bit of green here in my fine brush, and I want some green in the core too. And not it's okay to come closer to the brown because you do want those blends. So it's a natural color there, and it doesn't feel like, we've created polka dots. I'm using both colors right now, just going back and forth, same brush, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. We will come back with a darker tone of brown to define the dark center. But right now we are just spreading out the greens and the browns and the blends. Just a little bit of yellowish green. I don't know how well you see it on the camera, but these blends are what make watercolor so unique and so interesting without a lot of effort. The water does the job. Right, we'll come back to it with a darker tone. So I'm going to make a darker brown, adding more reds and blues to it. So if you see the edge where the petal is hitting the core of the flower, just try to, excuse me, give it a little bit of color in between the petals so it looks like it's the dark space in between the petals. So just so I'm thinking I'm going to do a dark ring closer to the outer edge of the core, and then I'll go back in the center and have a similar dark tone. I'm thinking sunflowers, and they have these very beautiful detailed um, patterns in the centers. If you see, it's like a perfectly made pattern, how the core design overlaps. Gonna leave that to dry. You see this is bleeding a little too much into the petal. That's fine because I'm gonna go back with my medium-sized brush, and when we add some darker details there, it will blend it. So right now what I did is I washed my brush. There's no color at all in it. Just quickly wiped it, make sure there's no color. Still want only a little bit of water. I'm gonna place it here and I'm gonna do this inside to outside brush movement and spread that dark color to the edges. So it doesn't look like a blot there, it's just spread. And we will need to do more of those dark tones on the petal edges anyway. So when you get a color blot like this, right, let me just place some color here. And if that's not what you want, you can't erase in watercolor, but what you could do, it's called color lifting with the brush. You wash the brush, make it just wet enough, but not too wet. And then you go in there and you lift. You wash, you dry, and you lift. And it's not only for fixing mistakes, it's actually a technique that you use to create third dimensions. We could be doing that on these petals too, right? Once we do all the dark tones, we lift it from the place where you get the highlights because of the light shining on it. We'll do that for the droplets and the petals. I hope everyone is following along and enjoying the process.
I love this. The center chord looks amazing with that little like point technique.
Mm-hmm.
It really does add some dimension to it.
It truly does. And I always have to remind myself leaving some white color is always something I appreciate at the end, or I go back and think I should have. It's nice to have that. Even if it's tiny, it gives it the dimension. So a little bit of white space is always good. I'm going to go in with a little bit brighter color now because a brighter colored flower is best for the water droplet to pop, so we can use more color. As you can see here, I'm going around the water droplet because this is the one I haven't masked. Now I don't want that much color on this droplet, so, and I have too much color here, so I'm not spreading it. I want this side to be lighter. Clean brush. Petals in the back will always get a deeper, darker, and in the shade color. So when you're picking the colors, keep in mind petals that are behind will get a darker tone. I'm going to come back with a darker tone, but since my brush has this color, I'm going around on each petal. I have a little bit darker tone here, and that's going in between these petals here. I moved away because it was too much color. I'm going to come back to spread it. We will be bringing in a brown tone to get the final shadows. So for the petal on the top to stand out, the things in the back have to be made a little darker to differentiate between the plains and plain water to blend it. You might be thinking I don't go too systematically from one petal to the other. What I'm really doing is I'm managing the level of wetness in each petal. When it's too wet and I want to wait for it to dry, I go and start the other one. So that's the reason why I'm moving back and forth. This is a good time to introduce the mid rib if there is in your flower. You don't want it to be too dark, just suggestive. If you do add that, keep in mind if the water droplet is on top of it, the water droplet should also reflect the change in color. I've heard from a lot of expert watercolor painters. They work on it. Watercolors are usually, unless you're doing a very large piece, you would most likely finish it in one sitting, right? But I hear from them that do it, keep it on the easel or on your table, come back to it next morning to see if you want to do anything or not. Don't immediately decide on overdoing or finishing it. You just want to reflect on it after you come back um, after some time. So I try to remind me of that, but I'm often impatient. And that's when I feel like I should have stopped one step back. Now, if you use acrylics or um, oil colors, you don't have that problem. You can literally start over on any piece of work if you decide to change anything. Watercolor doesn't give you that, but then watercolor gives you this beautiful light transparent effect. I think I'm going to stop here. I'm going to go back to the browns that you see are blending into the orange and everything on my palette, but that's what I love. I want something in between here. Keep in mind you want to have very little color, and we'll just go into the core side, very little color, not too wet. From this, I just want to do inside to outside, just some strokes like this for the brown shadows from the core to go into the leaves. Not too dark, just and keep your tissue handy. You can wipe off extra color if you feel like it's too much. It's these little things. Now we are beginning to add shadows. You see the brown is where it's for the petals that are in the back. This petal is on the top, so the petal behind will have a shadow. Now I'm going a little bit harder on the color. It's not just a stroke from the inside to outside, but I'm really defining the shape of the petal. Use this to go around the shape of the petal. Everything is still not too dry, so we can come back and blend if we see any of the brush strokes looking too hard. What do you think? Should I keep going or time to step back, take a look?
I think it looks pretty good.
So while we wait for that to dry, let's talk about the background. That's going to be wet. We want the edges of the flower to be fairly dry so that the background color doesn't bleed into the flower. A little bleeding is actually looks really artsy, so don't worry about it too much. But since we are doing a detail, like a zoomed in image of a flower, you also want to kind of let that have some sharp, defined edges. If you're thinking of a photograph, it should be in focus. Um, so when we do the background, it's up to you. You could choose the color. Um, we will have it lighter tone on the outer side and closer to the flower. It will be really dark. So the flower will pop out of that dark background. You could choose a green tone and we can go from light to really dark in greens. So if you think of a photograph, you're zooming into the flower and everything behind it is a blur. It could be in the middle of branches, so you could also think of browns behind, or shades of grays. So it's really up to you. It's about the light. It's going to be lighter on the outer sides and much very deep dark closer to the profile of the flower. So I'm going to let it dry a little on this side, but I'm starting to mix the color. I think I want green. And why am I thinking green? Because I see a teeny bit of green here. I want to complement that and balance it here. So I'll have a little bit of the greens here on the outer side, and it'll be much darker on the inner side, like a really deep green. So I think visually it'll be a nice color balance. But a brown might look just as fine. So that's why every artist's work is different, because you cannot, even if I tried to recreate my very own work, I wouldn't be able to, because every time you take the colors and you have a different idea, or you want to communicate something for that work. So it always is a little bit different for even ourselves. So you see, I started with very wet color. Another thing you could do is take clean fresh clear water and just put water on the backdrop, and then when you put color on it, it'll start to spread. So that's a wet and wet technique we talked about. I'm not going to go anywhere close to the petal at this point. I'm just kind of staying far from it. We'll come back and finish it. So when you want it really light, you could just do the clear water and then drop in color on top of it. So it can help spread the color, but you want to do it far from the petals. So yeah. Now there are two things. One, we could spend a lot of time to make a perfectly even colored background, or we could actually play with texture, which I personally like for the effect too, and it just takes the pressure off of, are the brush strokes showing? Is it even? Did I do a good job? Did I color in well? That's not what we want to do. So it's up to you. I'm going to do the texture. So you see, I'm leaving a little bit of white around it. Now I'm going to be a little extra careful. Washed my brush, dried it. There's water on the paper already. I'm going closer to the petals and just using clear water to blend it in. So I'm really not bringing much color close to the petals just yet. That we will do in a more dry state. but I don't want it to look like a white patch to deal with later. So I'm just blending in this shade. I like a little bit of space in these petals because not all petals are always evenly placed. So it's good to have some negative space coming into the positive. So it's not two blocks like flower and background. We are letting the background bleed into the subject. So it's creating a connection. Right. So of course we have patches here, but we'll play with that. Let's use our beautiful yellows and blues to create various shades of green. And let's use the cauliflower effect to our advantage. Sometimes it's unwanted, sometimes we'll make use of it. How are we doing on time? It's almost 5. Coming in with a little bit of color, and I hope it's not too wet anymore. If you want it to dry sooner, you could always use a dryer. I personally have a simple, not too expensive hair dryer in my studio, and you could just use that to dry the colors before you go into the details. Or if you're patient, you can just wait. All right, still a big blob there. We'll deal with it in the next layer. I do like a little bit of a bluish green to add the third dimension. So even though I just took the blue color, since there's green on the paper, it's doing the blend for me right away on the paper. All right. Washing the brush, wiping it, coming in with just clear water on my brush to blend any of these hard borders it may have created. Watercolor is, we work in watercolor in many, many layers, just one layer on top of the other. Slowly building up the third dimension. All right, while these, I'll know better when it starts to dry. I do need a little here. It just feels like it's ignored part of the background. Need to give it some definition. These little, see how tiny this backdrop space is, but they are so important to bring the background into the subject here. So the third time I went in there to get the green in. I don't like the white cauliflower I'm getting here. Blend, blend, blend. Okay. Going to switch over to my medium brush, get a little bit of a darker green to come closer and outline and get some dark around the flower. It is a little wet because I just came in here and did one layer. Let's see it. We will do the same thing here when we are thinking of how dark. The parts on the right side of the petal here to define the petal and to, because everything will drop a little shadow around it, right? That's how we see things in 3D. So the darkest part would be closest to the edge here, like this. I just took more water because I'm going to start blending this. I'm moving it out so it doesn't go into bleed into the flower. Much drier here. Hey Jeremy, do you sometimes paint along when you're hosting?
I do. I didn't have I don't have any more watercolor. I used some last week when I hosted, so I don't have any enough left. But I do like to. It's fun.
Nice.
I like watching. You know, it's like watching like a Bob Ross show. I just like watching you paint. It's enjoyable just to watch.
I'm asking because, even as a kid, when I saw somebody paint, I just wanted to start doing it myself. I didn't have the patience to watch, and I would
Right.
be really anxious to get my hands on it.
That's awesome.
It's funny because when I go to the kids' schools, when they were little, um, to help out in the classroom,
Right.
and sometimes the kids wouldn't be doing it, but I'd be sitting there and coloring with their material.
That's funny.
All right, so you see, I'm just blending it out some more. I'm going to start rushing a little bit because I want to save a few minutes for the star of the show, our watercolor the water droplets. At this point, you can take a really dark tone here, and we are only doing an outline. I just realized I'm using my thick brush for it. Shouldn't. Honestly, if you have a good brush, even if it's thick and it has a nice shape to it, you can easily go from some finer work um, to broad strokes. It's just the shape of the brush.
Someone commented they like taking screen captures to record the progression of techniques she applies to build up the painting. And just to let everyone know, we do record these and put up on the LCPL online programs YouTube channel. So if you like techniques or if you like a certain picture, by all means, you can go back to it on demand and try to perfect your paintings.
So as I look at this, I feel like this is just feeling too lonely here, this piece, and I wanted to kind of balance it with a little bit of green coming into the other petals, and that's where I started extending it in some more.
Mekhla, someone asked what type of sketch pad you use. I think you mentioned it was a 6x6. Is there a specific brand or kind of paper
Sure.
that it is?
Yeah. So actually, I'm looking in my drawer. If you can find anything that is more cotton content, so any brand is good. Canson is good. Waterford is fine for practice too. If you don't mind spending a lot on your paper, nothing, and I say that nothing comes close to Arches, Arches, Arches watercolor paper. And they are expensive, but if you're doing some really good work that you want to preserve, I think it's worth spending on the arches. Just the colors, the blends, the bleeds, and when you lift color, you'll see how it works really well. But if you were shopping for watercolor paper, Winsor and Newton is not too far from Arches, but costs about the same or maybe a little bit less. If you see a new brand, look for the cotton content. If it says 100% cotton, that's a good paper for watercolor. Look at the weight. Usually 350 pounds is probably the best you get, but even half or about a little less than that works just fine. The weight of the paper matters if you're going to do many, many layers in your painting. Like in landscapes, I do multiple wet on wet on wet layers. So you want the paper to be able to stand that kind of wet, working with that much wetness. I am not a fan of the blends here, but I'm going to hold off. We can always go in there with another layer of color, but I want to first go in and get started on the droplets. So time to remove this little piece of paper we taped on this. Another thing, this tape, be careful, it could rip off a layer of the paper, so just carefully remove that. So you see you have white space there. Now you can work on the droplets. This is inexpensive, easy technique. This is the masking fluid that we put at the beginning. If it's a larger area, you can use an eraser. Sometimes just rubbing it with your fingertip also works. You see, and it just comes out like a thin film. And seems like I didn't do this one too well, so there's some yellow that bled into it, but that's fine. And then the others, we didn't go on it with too much dark. So one or two, we'll try to use white on it, and we'll try these different techniques here. So this is where we're getting our finer brush and really darkest blue. So when you have a really dark blue and you want it to be almost black, remember we talked about, I don't use black. This would be a one where we could make an exception because we want to go really dark. But I think in watercolor, a dark brown works better than a black, because as soon as you introduce water to the black, it's not as deep anymore. So I stay with, you see, I'm trying to create a really dark color. And this will be a little bit of a finer work. If you have a fine tip black pen, you could use it later too. Not right now, but just keep this color ready. And if you want a fine finish to the water droplet, you could use that too. I'm not going to start with such a dark tone because it's hard to go back if that doesn't work well. But the water droplet, like we said, it's going to take a shade of yellow because the petal is yellow, but it's going to be much lighter. So I take a small, tiny portion, quantity of fresh yellow. I don't want it to be gray or the browns that we used for the shadows. I want a clean color, and my water right now is, I made both pots dirty. So now we said the light is coming from here. So if the light is coming from here, this part, the left side of the water droplet will get much darker areas. So we'll start with a little bit of yellow tones here, just not a lot, on only one side of the droplet. One will be highlighted in white and the other side gets a little bit of yellow. See, it's hard to see the color probably on the camera, but I hope you can imagine. While that's drying, we don't want much wet in wet here. I'm going to bring in my white. Remember, we put it aside just for these few droplets here. just half of it, you want it to be white. This is great for smaller, tinier drops. This one had a little yellow in there, so. I'm tempted to put a few more drops. And then we have these half drops here. All right. Now I'm getting a little bit of the darker yellow with the orangey tone to it. Very little bit. The other side, you want a little color to define the outer side. And come back and highlight it with white if we need to. Now we going back to that almost black tone we created. Now I do not have any water on my brush. The brush is wet, but that's it. Don't have too much water because I don't want it um, to float around too much. I want it to stay where I want it to be. So we're outlining the droplet, but only a half. We will only see that the side where the shadow is falling. So it's the opposite side of the light. Where did we get all the drops? Now that same dark tone, but not as deep, I'm going to take some water on my brush and create a lighter tone or a lower value of this. You see how with the water it's much lighter. You don't want too much color because the drops are tiny. And you have the color on it, take off some of it. What I'm going to do is spread the shadow a little bit because we don't want it to look like an outline. A shadow spreads out. So we want it to have a little bit of a, that's too much, too much. I'm gonna have to come back and fix that. See about this, for the shadow, that's too much. Too dark and too much. So be careful with that. See, now my brush got a little white from the ones that had some white, and it's anytime you have white, it starts to become very pastel-like, which if that's not the theme of your work, It looks unnatural. Right, so I'm going back to fix this big black blob I have. So I'm taking white to the rescue. See, white works, but it'll still have that little grayness to it. So I'm gonna have to do it 2 or 3 times. Even after the class, I'll probably come back and do it when it dries completely to cover up. Now, if you have a fine black pen, that's fine. If not, go with the finer brush, but extra, extra fine. We do not want it to be as thick as this side. The other side of the water droplet, very fine line. Do they look like water droplets from what you're seeing? Getting white on my brush. Coming back to add even darker here, just a little bit. To take a little bit of yellow to add some and I'm gonna go back to get some white. This is thick color. So watercolors offer so much transparency. There's another type of pigment called gouache, if you want to look it up. Gouache could be watercolor or acrylic, but they are opaque. So for things like these, when we are doing highlights, gouache works really well because you'll need fewer layers. Sometimes a good quality gouache, you won't need that many layers. Here I'll have to go over and over it again because this is watercolor, transparent watercolor. Right. I do not like the background as much. I want it to be much deeper. So I'm going to go in a little bold this time, taking a darker, much darker green. And I hope I don't mess it up. We may be coming close to time. So if we have to end the session, what I'm going to do later after I blend in the background a little bit, I'm going to come with a slightly darker tone of yellow and outline the petals, especially the overlapping ones. So the top ones kind of stand out a little bit from the background. Okay, that's where I wanted to go with. Really dark, really dark, really dark. I'm going to go back to my yellow to bring in the light. I don't want it to be flat. Usually when it dries, you start to see where the blends are working and when it's not, and then you might sometimes have to go back in. Since it's so wet, and if I put my brush on it, I'm actually lifting color, so it's not helping. Right. I'll let that dry and see how that's going to turn out. Going back to my fine brush, darker yellow, orangey yellow. You can see my water is really dirty right now. I could use fresh water at this point. As we were doing the background, the shape of the flower is not as sharp with some of the color blends. So that's what you want to do here is clean up the edges. I would also like to go into the core and add one more fresh coat of a dark dots. What am I missing? I'm definitely going to come back to it a few hours later and clean up some edges, add a little bit more to highlight the water droplets. But that's really it. You keep looking at it. Right. Really dark brown. You could also use the really dark green that you created, just add a little red to it so it'll become even darker. And more on the browner side. It's going back here to add one more fresh coat of dark. So the core pops too. And don't forget to sign your work. One last thing, one more time. Going to my white. Want this to pop. And that's it, Jeremy. Just finishing this up.
It looks beautiful.